Putin has to pretend that what he's doing is a success, because otherwise it would be an admission that all of the lives that have been lost in Russia were for nothing. And of course, the central part of the mythology is that by invading Ukraine, he rescued Russia from an impending catastrophe. He has to stick to that story because it's the only way he can justify everything that's going on in Russia today. The state of the economy, of course, is one of those things where Putin can pretend that a disastrous situation is actually relatively positive, like in previous years where he's boasted of Russia's low unemployment figures without pointing out that they come about as a result of hundreds of thousands of Russians emigrating and hundreds of thousands more being incapacitated on the battlefield. So yes, he can look at ways of turning all of the negative figures about the way Russia's economy is going into success stories.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. And this time we are joined by Keir, Giles, a Russia analyst at the international affairs think tank Chatham House. He's previously worked at the UK Defence Academy and is the author of multiple publications explaining the Russian approach to warfare. His latest book is Who Will Defend Europe? An Awakened Russia and a Sleeping Continent. Keir, welcome back to Frontline. Good to see you again.
Hello.
Hello. Of course, President Putin's annual end of the year press conference took place today, and it was, four and a bit hours long. What does it tell us about how confident he's feeling and the image he wants to show the world?
Well, you mentioned the length of the event there, and I think that's one of the things that to pay attention to even before we look at the content. The fact that Putin, whose state of health visibly comes and goes, is now sufficiently fit to actually undergo one of these marathon events that he runs from time to time, rather than the times when his health has dipped and we've seen him barely able to manage 5 minutes on stage. So that in itself will probably have put him in a good, positive, upbeat mood about his own personal prospects in Russia. And that, of course, is an impression that he's trying to convey about the way Russia is going overall, not just in its war on Ukraine, but also the economy, social problems, all of the things that people are bringing up in these in excess of 2.4 million questions to Putin, we're told by the Russian authorities, most of which were pointing at problems in Russian life, but he's trying to put a positive spin on everything.
Can we just go through some of the statements he made and maybe get some of your quick fire responses to them? On Ukraine, he should have acted earlier and prepared more for this full-scale invasion.
Yes, Putin has to pretend that everything is going well and he made the right choice in the first place, even though it's blatantly obvious to the rest of the world that he miscalculated wildly. So he has to reinforce this idea that it was the right decision and, of course, Russia is achieving its objectives.
On negotiation, Russia always prepared for compromise. It was Ukraine that refused to hold negotiations, and he'll only talk to Zelensky if he wins an election because he considers him illegitimate.
Yes, when you unpick that statement, Russia's always ready for compromise, you see that the conditions mean Russia is in effect never ready for compromise. Russia is not willing to undertake negotiations with the head of state that they're attacking, and they're not willing to compromise on their demands, which are effectively the dismemberment of Ukraine.
On the Resurgence missile, he suggested a technological duel in Kyiv to test whether the weapon can be stopped by its air and missile defense systems.
It's nice and easy for Putin to suggest things that look like a challenge to the West and a challenge that will never be accepted or responded to because it's ridiculous. But Putin has been working very hard, along with the rest of the Russian information warfare apparatus, to keep the idea of this Oreshnik as a wonder weapon in the world's media and in front of people when they're considering Russia's options for escalation.
And the reality is?
And the reality is they have very few of them, we're told. They're not able to mass produce them. And it's not at all clear what challenge this actually really does pose either to Ukraine or to the West more broadly.
Russia's goals in Ukraine. He says Russia has succeeded and moved away from the brink of the abyss. He's done everything for Russia's sovereignty.
Again, Putin has to pretend that what he's doing is a success, because otherwise it would be an admission that all of the lives that have been lost in Russia were for nothing. And of course, the central part of the mythology is that by invading Ukraine, he rescued Russia from an impending catastrophe. He has to stick to that story because it's the only way he can justify everything that's going on in Russia today.
Is there anything here that I missed there that you want to pick up on?
Out of 4.5 hours of press conference, there was plenty we haven't talked about. The state of the economy, of course, is one of those things where Putin can pretend that a disastrous situation is actually relatively positive, like in previous years where he's boasted of Russia's low unemployment figures without pointing out that they come about as a result of hundreds of thousands of Russians emigrating and hundreds of thousands more being incapacitated on the battlefield. So yes, he can look at ways of turning all of the negative figures about the way Russia's economy is going into success stories.
Let's just talk a little bit about the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine next year. What is the likelihood that Putin will be emboldened to cause more trouble elsewhere in Europe with the familiar pretense of defending Russian-speaking communities should that happen?
I think we should expect more trouble elsewhere in Europe anyway. Because if you look at the pattern of when Russia reaches out beyond Ukraine to try to cause mayhem, as it's been described across Europe, the campaigns of arson and murder and sabotage, those die down when things are relatively speaking going Russia's way, and they spike when something happens that Russia dislikes. And that's the pattern we saw very clearly in 2024, when this massive number of reports of Russian sabotage campaigns in the late spring, early summer, and then a bit of a lull for the rest of the year. But let's look at what's happened towards the end of 2024. You've got not only this slight easing of restrictions by the United States on Western precision-guided munitions being used by Ukraine deep into Russia, you've also had this high-profile assassination of a very prominent Russian general in the center of Moscow. These are things which Russia will be very much upset by, and we can expect that there will be some kind of backlash in terms of them mounting their campaigns again to cause disruption, to cause mayhem, to target innocent civilians across Europe.
And also the toppling of Assad and Russia potentially losing its military bases in Syria.
Well, let's not forget that, as Putin said today, of course that's not a defeat for Russia. Plainly to the rest of the world, absolutely it is. And this is a major setback in terms of Russia's aims to expand its power base beyond its immediate neighborhood, and particularly beyond Ukraine. But we shouldn't read too much into that for the war aims in Ukraine itself and for the priority that Putin has set on this war. The other aspects of Russia's power expansion across the world are probably disposable, although they're regrettable for the Kremlin. But Ukraine is absolutely essential, and so we shouldn't expect any diminution of effort that is being put into the destruction of Ukraine.
When you said that Russia causes trouble elsewhere when things are not going so well, what would a ceasefire in Ukraine mean? Would it mean more activity elsewhere or less?
It depends entirely on how that ceasefire comes about. Now, the key element that everybody is explaining to President Trump and others about a ceasefire in Ukraine is that in order to last, it needs some kind of security guarantee for whatever part of Ukraine remains free. It needs some kind of means of deterring Russia from simply taking advantage of a pause in the fighting to rebuild its forces and then have another go. Without security guarantees to deter Russia from attacking again, it makes no sense at all for Ukraine to play along with signing any kind of ceasefire. Now, interestingly, in his speech, Putin acknowledged this in the classic Russian way of spinning the whole thing round and pretending that it is actually Russia that needs security guarantees in the event of a ceasefire. So we can see that this message has been received and understood by Moscow, and that's another reason why we may expect that Donald Trump might find it harder than he thinks to bring the two sides together into some kind of negotiated settlement, because neither Russia nor Ukraine is interested in a deal on the kind of terms that have been described so far.
One thing you can say about President Putin is he is an absolute master of disinformation and of propaganda. And you mentioned earlier Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, the head of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical defenses forces, who also was a master of propaganda as well. How much of a loss, I mean, what do you think the reaction is in Russia, both from the public and from Putin to that?
I think Master of Propaganda and Disinformation is a slightly flattering title. We can simply say that he's very good at lying with a straight face. But yes, Igor Kirillov too was one of the mouthpieces of some of the more ridiculous and extraordinary disinformation narratives that we've heard from Russia, not just about Ukraine, but also before that, about the Skripals, about Syria. There's no doubt that such a senior and prominent individual being targeted within Moscow the day after sentences passed for war crimes in Kiev will have rattled some of the Russian security elite, because it shows that you cannot commit war crimes there or elsewhere with impunity and expect to get away with it forever. And let's not forget, this is a country that is led by a president who himself is internationally wanted for war crimes.
He was held responsible for thousands of chemical attacks along the front line in Ukraine, which has aided Russia on the offensive. Will his death make any difference, or is there just someone ready to pick up where he left off?
There's no reason to suspect that this will actually mean any lessening in the number of chemical weapons attacks that are carried out on the front lines in Ukraine or indeed elsewhere, because let's not forget the Salisbury poisonings in 2018 were with the use of a chemical weapon. But either way, The fact that Ukraine can, in fact, reach in and target these senior commanders has to have some kind of effect in making people think twice about their actions as well as about their personal security.
And according to an assessment in Foreign Policy magazine, by late 2025, Russia will begin running out of equipment for its war in Ukraine as its defense industrial base feels the strain. Do you agree? And how should Ukraine's allies prepare for this?
That figure of late 2025, by which time Russia will be feeling the pinch economically and in terms of manpower and in terms of equipment, has emerged as a kind of consensus over the last few months from people who watch all of these indicators very closely. And these are people that I know and I trust their assessment. So I think it's entirely plausible. But in the meantime, of course, we have a whole year to get through with Donald Trump in the White House. And based on past performance, we shouldn't rule out the possibility that Trump will seek to rescue Putin from that problem by putting an end to the war so that Russia can rebuild its military capacity faster without Ukraine eroding it as rapidly, almost as rapidly as it's rebuilding it. So if there is a ceasefire agreement on the table which suits Putin, presented by Trump, we can expect that Russia might play along. The wild card, of course, is still Ukraine and Ukraine's will to survive.
An assessment of Putin's goals in foreign affairs publication says that almost 3 years into the full-scale war in Ukraine, Putin is more committed than ever to the war and that there is no turning back now from his broader confrontation with the West. That Russia is already preparing the ground to expand through sabotage and other special operations in Europe. The question we need to address, is it not, and it says this, is how dangerous is Russia and what efforts should be made to contain it? What's your assessment?
Well, how dangerous is Russia? We shouldn't really be asking this question at this point. This is a country that has launched a colonial war of reconquest with genocidal aims against its neighbor and is rebuilding its armed forces as rapidly as possible to launch attacks further afield. There's now a strong consensus across NATO from chiefs of defense and from defense ministers, defense intelligence chiefs, all agreeing that Russia is looking to its next target as a NATO member, and that is 3 to 5 years away in terms of how long it'll take them to rebuild their forces. So the threat is clear. And the real question is, why is it that some European countries are still acting as though we are in peacetime? You see the urgent preparations that are being made by the frontline states, the rapid rearmament in countries like Poland, overhauling civil defense in countries like Finland and Sweden. And yet further afield, there's still the impression that distance lends security. And you have countries like the UK, which are still resolutely refusing to make that kind of transformative investment in conventional military defense or any investment at all in civil defense in the face of this clear and growing threat.
For the countries that are still acting as though we are still in peacetime, what time are we in?
We've seen a resurgence in all of the terminology that's used for the kinds of acts of war that Russia carries out. They're called hybrid warfare, they're called gray zone warfare, subthreshold warfare, all of these different adjectives that are applied to what Russia does, which provide a cynical excuse for not responding to them. Because if you simply call them warfare, then you have to accept that the other side is at war with you, and that leads to uncomfortable political choices. Eventually, there will come a point where it is no longer deniable. And the real question is whether that happens before or after tanks and missiles start crossing borders.
Do you think it's time to change the definition of what war is?
Well, people have tried very hard to change the definition of what war is by classifying all of these warlike acts as something like hybrid warfare or whatever other terminology you might like to use it. Now, back in the 1990s, when Russia's conventional military forces were still broken and incapable, they put a lot of thought into how else they could win wars other than rolling tanks across the borders. And they put a lot of effort into understanding that boundary between peace and war. But all that theorizing has been overtaken by practice because Russia has pushed at the boundaries and the Western boundaries have receded. In other words, Russia's got away with more and more thinking that they would trigger some kind of strong reaction from the West, but there's been no reaction. So that line between where is peace and where is war has shifted significantly just over the last decade.
So, if you accept that Russia's foreign policy is now based on confrontation and the Russian Federation is now on a war economy, will Putin want to abandon it ever, or will he be just looking for the next confrontation, even if the fighting stops in Ukraine?
We hear a lot about how Putin is now trapped into this path of war, that he doesn't have any choice because of this restructuring of the Russian economy into a war economy, because of staking his reputation on the war in Ukraine. Apparently, he has no choice other than to push forward. But there's no indication that I can see that this isn't what he wants to do anyway. Putin's laid out very clearly his ambition for restoring Russian power over those countries that we think of as sovereign, independent nations neighboring Russia, and of course, with which countries like the UK have treaty obligations. We're obliged to defend them. So that leads inevitably to setting the stage for conflict between Russia and the West as a whole.
Where do you think he will look for the next conflict?
We don't know where Russia will move next. And that may not necessarily even be somewhere that is right next door to Russia, because, as we discussed earlier, the frontline states are the ones that are busy making themselves hard targets because they don't want to follow the path of Ukraine. They don't want to be the next victim. They remember what it's like to be under Russian domination. The problem is there are plenty of soft targets elsewhere in Europe. For instance, if Russia wants to carry out the kind of campaign of coercion or deterrence or punishment that we've seen against Ukraine using air and missile assets at extremely long ranges, it might choose a country that has decided not to install any integrated air and missile defense, like, for example, the UK, which is completely open and defenseless against that kind of campaign.
That's a frightening thought. Your book, Who Will Defend Europe? An Awakened Russia and a Sleeping Continent. What is the main message? What is the cautionary note that you're trying to put in out?
It's very much what we've been talking about over the last few minutes. It is the fact that Russia is still intent on pushing further and attacking further into Europe, that it has been rebuilding its land forces. By April this year, they were already 15% larger than the army that started the war, that its naval and air forces are still largely untouched and they can deliver destruction at extremely long ranges. And finally, Western Europe as a whole has not gripped the problem of restoring its defenses in order that it can actually either deter an attack like that from Russia, or if deterrence fails, withstand it. And with this general lack of civil defense preparation and understanding that war can come to the homeland as well, that could have catastrophic consequences across Western Europe.
What does Europe need to do right now?
There's so much that has already been done. And the answer to the question in the title of the book, Who Will Defend Europe, is look to the frontline states. Look at countries like Poland, who have decided that they have no choice but to rearm in order to keep Russia out. Look at countries like Finland with its comprehensive defense policy, making sure that the economy, society, individuals can still continue to function when Russia is doing its best to stop them. There are positive examples in the eastern part of the continent for how you can go about Russia-proofing your future. It's just that those examples are not yet being followed by countries like the UK.
Finally, if we think back to this time last year and Putin's year-end presser, has much changed? And what do you think he'll be aiming to deliver this time next year?
Well, sadly, the trend is completely unchanged. Everything that we could foresee happening in 2024 is much the same as we expected at the end of last year. The one wild card that is coming up, of course, is 20th of January 2025. Now, ordinarily, when you think about pivotal dates in a war that decide victory or defeat, they're written in the history books after the war is over. It's unusual that in this case, we can see the date coming a long way in advance, because the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House may well be make or break for Ukraine.
Are you expecting, I did say final question, but you maybe want to ask another one. Are you expecting any particular manoeuvring by the Kremlin ahead of that date? Are you expecting to see any change in what the Kremlin does or says in the countdown to that date?
Russia ought to be very careful not to offend the United States in general or Donald Trump in person before 20th of January, because there's no reason to expend effort in Ukraine on achieving things that Russia might actually be handed on a plate by Donald Trump as soon as he's in power.
Okay, Giles, it's great to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.